PowerPoint is designed to give you an introduction to accommodations for students with disabilities. We're going to talk about the difference between accommodations and modifications. We're going to talk about, and then we're going to talk about some examples of accommodations. So the first thing I want to do is talk about some language. It's important you understand the difference between accommodations and modifications because they aren't the same, but a lot of people use them interchangeably. Accommodations reduce barriers due to a disability. So, for example, if you have a student who is in science class and they're reading the science textbook, but they have a reading disability, they may not be getting all the content. So instead of having them read the book, you give them a book, an audiobook. Therefore, their learning disability is no longer causing a barrier. So accommodations retain the same learning goal. Modifications, on the other hand, change the level of difficulty. So in the same case of that science class, let's say instead of having that student read the whole chapter, they're just going to read one page. That has changed the learning goal of the activity. Let's look at another example. Students are required to write a multi-paragraph theme to demonstrate their ability to organize, write complete sentences, and coherently elaborate on a topic when writing. So some accommodations that may go along with this, depending on the disability. An idea diagram or graphic organizer on which the student can brainstorm and organize ideas. A partner to provide editing. A word processor. The option of dictating or accepting 3 rather than 5 paragraphs. So thinking about that learning goal, is it still being achieved? Absolutely. All those accommodations still allow the student to achieve this learning goal. Let's look at some modification examples. Have the student write 5 sentences about the topic as opposed to a 3-paragraph essay. Draw a picture about a topic or develop a poster on a particular topic. So is that still achieving the learning goal? No, it's not. When we think about this course and the focus it has on more high incidence disabilities such as learning disabilities, ADHD, emotional behavioral disorder, and high functioning autism, we are more focused on accommodations. We will talk about students with intellectual disability and students with severe autism, and that's where we're going to spend a little bit more time on modifications and how you would modify the material. Ultimately, though, you want to go back to the IEP and look at where the accommodations are listed. There's a specific place on the IEP and how much should be modified. If you're still not sure, you can always talk to the person who's in charge of writing that IEP. Typically, it's a special education teacher or case manager, and they can help you figure that out. So always remember, an accommodation is not an unfair advantage. It levels the playing field. If you have not watched the video from Fat City, the Rick Lavoie clip that's posted in Blackboard, you want to make sure that you do that. It's very short, and it gets the point across very well. There are questions that people need to think about when they select accommodations. But the most important thing about accommodations is that they should be personalized and individualized. That's what IDEA, the IEP, all of those are all about, being individualized. So not all students with reading disabilities need audiobooks, and not all students with a math disability need a calculator. It's important that the accommodations chosen are specific to the disability. That doesn't always happen, though. You may get multiple students from the same teacher and they're all going to have the same accommodations. And you, as a member of the IEP team, can call an IEP meeting at any point to try and clarify those and maybe help individualize those a little bit better. You also want to make sure that you are providing accommodations. So all the ones that are listed in the IEP, you are legally required to provide. Now, obviously, if calculator is listed and you don't teach math or you're not doing any math, you don't need to, provide that calculator. But the ones that are, that can happen in your classroom, you are legally required to provide those. So you want to look at those right away when you get students with disabilities, and you want to make sure that basically they're copacetic with your classroom, because if not, you need to discuss that and it needs to be fixed. It's just sometimes accommodations are written in a way that it's hard to implement them. Like if they're very specific to a certain class, it may not apply completely to your class. So you just want to make sure that those are clarified at the very least. There are 4 types of accommodations, and we're going to look at examples of each one. The first type of accommodation is a presentation accommodation. So this accommodates how content is delivered. This could be a teacher is standing up and giving a lecture. This could be a student is reading a handout or reading, a website. This could be watching a movie. So all of these are, this is how the student is receiving their information. If you have a student with any type of visual disability, large print is an example. Oral reading. If a student has a learning disability in reading, they may get an audio book, sign language, using graphics. Manipulatives are common for math. Another type of accommodation is response accommodation. This is how a student shows what they know. So an example could be, rather than writing out, remember we looked at that writing example, they could dictate what they know. A speech to text computer program, that's essentially the same thing as dictating, but they're dictating to the computer and the computer writes it. They could draw pictures, they could create alternative projects. Now remember, you just want to make sure that it achieves the same learning goal. So in the case for drawing a picture, when we looked at that modification, that was a modification because it changed the learning the learning goal, and it made the difficulty easier. In some cases, drawing a picture could just be an accommodation, right? So if you tell a student to write something about the parts of a cell and they have a writing disability, you could have a student, label a diagram or draw a diagram of a cell. And as long as they're achieving the same learning goal, that could work as an accommodation. Another type of accommodation is setting. This is where the student is doing their learning or they're showing what they know. So if they're taking a test, they can go take the test in another classroom or somewhere where it's quieter, less distractions. Sometimes students need lighting adjusted. They may need noise buffers such as headphones, earphones, earplugs. And then finally, scheduling accommodations. This accommodates the conditions under which the content is delivered. So giving a student extended time, multiple breaks. These are very common. The scheduling and the setting accommodations that we just talked about, these are very common on IEPs because they are the kind of accommodations that that work well with standardized tests. So as we're becoming more and more focused on standardized tests and taking those, we want to make sure that students with learning disabilities or disabilities are able to show what they know on those tests despite their disability. So these are very common to list on the IEP, because if you want a student to have accommodations on those tests, it must be listed on their IEP. So you can't just give a student, extended time on a standardized test if it's not on their IEP. It has to be on there. And if it's on the IEP, you need to do it in class. So it's something that's happening all the time, which makes sense because you want a student to be working in classroom with this under the same conditions that they're taking that standardized test, right? So if they're given, frequent breaks, they may be able to, maybe use those to their advantage a little bit better if they are practicing that all the time, right? So if you're giving a test in class and you're giving that frequent break, you can teach students what to do with that break time, right? So, a child is taking a test and you give them a break in the middle and you say, you know what, during this break, I want you to totally clear your mind, maybe look out the window, maybe doodle a picture, something like that, to give them that time, kind of teach them to get their mind off the test, refresh, come back, and then they're good. And then when they go to take that standardized test, they're going to know how to use that break to their advantage. And that's it. That's your PowerPoint on accommodations. So if you have any questions, let me know.